Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 342, The Cold War, Part 1. Last time, we covered the autobiography of Archpriest Avakum Petrov. Today, we will discuss the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, a conflict that would put the world in peril. And I will attempt to approach the Cold War from the Soviet side whenever possible. My sources for this series include A Failed Empire by Vladislav Zubok, Cold War, An International History by Carol Fink, The Cold War, A History by Martin Walker, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, by Anne Applebaum, and The Cold War, A World History by Odd Arne Westad. Growing up in New York City in the 1960s, when I was in elementary school, we had numerous emergency drills in case of a nuclear attack from the Soviets. Of course, hiding under your desk wasn't going to save you if the bomb hit anywhere near my school. Luckily, the Americans of the Soviet Union never did get into an actual war, although they used proxy nations all over the world to advance their objectives. Beginning right after the end of World War II in 1945, the Cold War would continue until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Its apex would come about in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, although some claim it was under the Reagan administration that tensions reached their highest levels in the 1980s. The first use of the term Cold War was by the author George Orwell in his October 19, 1945 article, quote, You and the Atomic Bomb. It read, quote, Looking at the world as a whole, the drift for many decades has not been towards anarchy, but towards the reimposition of slavery. James Burnham's theory has been much discussed, but few people have yet considered its ideological implications. That is, the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. 5 months later, in an article published in The Observer, Orwell would write the following, quote, After the Moscow Conference last December, Russia began to make a Cold War on Britain and the British Empire. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Cold War, I'm going to read two quotes. The first from Martin Walker's book, and the second from Odd Arne Westad. Quote, The history of the Cold War has been the history of the world since 1945. Communications and missile technology required the Cold War's proxy battle zones to girdle the entire Earth and its satellites to orbit above. The Cold War was truly a global conflict, more so than either of the century's two world wars. South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, continents which had been largely spared the earlier struggles, were sucked into its maw. Turks fought in Korea, Algerians fought in Vietnam, Cubans fought in Angola, and American and Russian school children had been interrupted by nuclear air raids, grew up to die in Saigon and Kabul. Now from chapter 1 of Westad's book, quote, The Cold War originated in two processes that took place around the turn of the 20th century. One was the transformation of the United States and Russia into two supercharged empires with a growing sense of international mission. The other was the sharpening of the ideological divide between capitalism and its critics. These came together with the American entry into World War I, the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the creation of a Soviet state as an alternative to capitalism. As a result of World War and the Depression, the Soviet alternative attracted much support around the world, but it also became a focus point for its enemies and rivals. By 1941, when the USSR and the United States entered World War II, the Soviet Union was internally more powerful than ever, but also more isolated internationally. The wartime interaction between the Soviets, the United States, and the greatest 19th century power, Great Britain, would determine the future framework for international relations. And this is where I find something really interesting by Zubok in his book, A Failed Empire, claims that the Cold War actually began internally in the Soviet Union. Here's what he had to say, quote, Stalin feared that the effect of Hiroshima, combined with the overall sense of laxity and fatigue after the war, would cause Soviet elites to seek an accommodation with the United States, perhaps even an acceptance of U.S. superiority. Molotov's softness during the London conference made him a target of Stalin's anger and suspicion. Back in Moscow in early October 1945, Molotov had to admit his errors before his own constituents at the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. He described the conference as a battlefield where certain American and British quarters launched the first diplomatic attack on the foreign policy gains of the Soviet Union. So what we see is that the beginning of the Cold War was in large part due to Stalin's paranoia. While Molotov was a target of Stalin's ire, it was the military leaders who would face the boss's wrath. The military was demobilizing from 12.5 million at its peak to 4.5 million. What worried Stalin was a situation similar to that faced by Tsar Alexander I after defeating Napoleon. What happened was the Soviet Union was a far worse place to live than Western Europe. The soldiers of the Red Army had seen the Soviet system wasn't as good as the propaganda machine had been telling them. Another group that would be caught in the crosshairs of Stalin's venom were the Jews. It would begin in 1946 when Zhdanov passed on the orders from the boss to start removing quote-unquote cosmopolitan cadres, a euphemism meaning the Jews. Many of the wives of Kremlin leaders were arrested, including Molotov's, President Mikhail Kalinin, and Alexander Poskir-Bayshev, among others. Then came the infamous Kremlin doctors affair, which claimed that there were doctors trying to assassinate Kremlin leaders. This, of course, would end with Stalin's death in 1953. Another target of Stalin's wrath post-World War II were ethnic groups that were not Russian. He didn't trust them as he felt that many of the ethnic groups sided with the Nazis and he was going to punish them. Armenians and Azeris were targets, with many being sent to Siberia. But the most surprising targets were those who survived the Leningrad siege. Stalin declared a Cold War on the heroes of the battle against the Nazis. One of the outcomes of the meetings between Stalin, Churchill, and the U.S. Presidents Roosevelt and then Truman was the division of post-war Europe, with the Soviet Union getting the eastern countries and the Allies protecting the West. The dividing line would be known as the Iron Curtain. The first mention after the war was in the speech known as Sinews of Peace, delivered by Winston Churchill on March 5, 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, where he said, quote, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe." This division, in which the Soviets would install puppet governments, including one in North Korea, would raise alarms in the West, prompting the U.S. to adopt something known as the Truman Doctrine of Containment of Communism in 1947, followed by the Marshall Plan the following year to help build and rebuild Western Europe. In 1949, in response to perceived Soviet aggression, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, also known as NATO. Surprisingly, it wasn't until after Stalin's death that the Soviets responded by creating the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The first real confrontation between the USSR and the West occurred during the Berlin blockade of 1948 and 49, which can be considered the first battle of the Cold War. The decision to split Berlin into different sectors was made. The Soviet Union blocked the Western Allies' railway, road, and canal access to the sectors of Berlin under Western control. This was done in response to West Germany introducing the new Deutsche Mark as its currency, which would drastically improve its economy, much to the chagrin of its Eastern German leaders. The Western Allies organized the Berlin Airlift from June 26, 1948 to September 30, 1949, to deliver supplies to the people of West Berlin, a difficult feat given the city's size and population. There would be over 277,000 aircraft landings over this period to help the people of West Berlin survive the blockade. The success of the Berliner Luftbrücke, or Berlin Air Bridge, caused Stalin to back off from his plan to take over the former capital of Nazi Germany. Here's a couple of interesting facts about the Berlin Airlift that I found quite fascinating. At the height of the operation, a plane filled with supplies landed every 45 seconds at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport. Over 2.3 million tons of supplies were funneled into the city, and there were 2.5 million civilians who were dependent on these supplies. Let's go back a few years to the creation of the Truman Doctrine in March 1947. It was developed in response to two communist rebellions, one in Greece and the other in Turkey. Truman said that the doctrines were intended to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Many historians use Truman's March 12, 1947 speech to Congress to mark the start of the Cold War. The Greek rebellion was precipitated by the refusal of the Communist Party of Greece, also known as the KKE, to disband and disarm after the Axis left the country, followed by the British entry. The Caserta Agreement, signed in 1944, provided that all resistance forces operating in Greece until then would be under the leadership of the Greek government, which would be under the control of General Ronald Scobie. This would lead to the Greek Civil War. The KKE was funded by the Yugoslav government led by Tito. The British could no longer help the Greek government after the war as their economy was in tatters. In 1946, so the Americans took over. The following year, the British informed the Turkish government that they could no longer provide financial assistance. This would precipitate the crisis in the Turkish Straits. The Soviet government pressured the Turkish government to allow Soviet shipping to flow freely through the Turkish Straits, which connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The U.S. position was that, instead of waiting for an armed conflict with the Soviet Union, it would adopt a policy of containment, thereby initiating the Truman Doctrine. The president's speech to Congress lasted 18 minutes and was followed by approval of $400 million in military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. This would be followed by the Marshall Plan, enacted in 1948 to provide foreign assistance to Western Europe. The United States transferred $13.3 billion, equivalent to $137 billion in today's money, for economic recovery programs in Western Europe. This would last for 3 years and end in 1951. The aid package was the opposite of what the Soviets were doing in their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. They began to strip those countries of much of their resources to rebuild the Soviet Union after the devastation they suffered at the hands of the Soviet Union or the hands of the Germans. I saw this firsthand when my father and I traveled to East Berlin to meet our cousins. In 1970, 25 years after the end of the war, there were still bullet holes in many of the buildings we walked past. The city was gray and lifeless, in total contrast to West Berlin, which was amazingly modern for the time, with few reminders of the devastation it had endured during the war. General George Marshall of the U.S. met with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov in January 1947 to discuss the rebuilding of Europe. After 6 weeks of negotiations, the Soviet side rejected all American and British proposals and demanded unconditional fulfillment of all prior reparation claims. This was done in a response to a ciphered telegram from Vyazhinsky, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, to Molotov on Stalin's orders. Marshall's response to the Soviet rejection was given in a speech on June 5, 1947 at Harvard University. He said, quote, "The modern system of the division of labor upon which the exchange of products is based is in danger of breaking down. Aside from the demoralizing effect on the world at large and the possibilities of disturbances arising as a result of the desperation of the people concerned, the consequences to the economy of the United States should be apparent to all. Logically, the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health to the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Any government that is willing to assist in recovery will find full cooperation on the part of the United States. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist." And my parents used to tell me stories about how the Marshall Plan did so much for them when they were pretty much starving after the war. They were living in Hamburg, Germany, and without it, they said many people would have died. So it did save, in our estimation, millions of people, not only in Germany, but throughout many of the Western nations at the time. What the Soviet Union feared was that America would try to buy loyalty from European nations. On October 10, 1946, Molotov stated the following, quote, "If American capital was given a free hand in the small states ruined and enfeebled by the war, it would buy up local industries, appropriate the more attractive Romanian, Yugoslav enterprises, and would become the master in these small states." Well, in my opinion, Molotov was probably right, although instead of paying for it, the Soviet Union just took it. Now, on July 13th, another meeting was held in Paris to discuss the rebuilding of Europe. Almost all Western nations attended, except Spain, which was officially neutral during the war, and Andorra, San Marino, Monaco, and Liechtenstein. Surprisingly, Czechoslovakia and Poland agreed to attend, but unsurprisingly, they were prevented from doing so by the Soviets. Finland also declined as it wanted to appease their neighbor to the east. Of course, the Soviet Union had to respond to the West's plans by holding its own conference, the Cominform, which was held in the resort town, and I am probably going to botch this name terribly, but I'll give it a try, Zyklarska Poreba in southwest Poland. At the meeting of 9 communist country leaders, the Marshall Plan was described as, quote, "the American plan for the enslavement of Europe." Now, it claimed that the world was now breaking down, quote, into basically 2 camps, the imperialist and the anti-democratic camp on one hand, and the anti-imperialist and democratic camp on the other, which they claimed was the Soviet Union. Anne Applebaum, in the book Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, described the conference this way, quote, "The Cominform's creation is sometimes described as an ambush, a surprise assertion of Soviet power that sealed the fate of all present. Others have called it a turning point, the moment when the Soviet Union dropped its tolerance of Eastern Bloc pluralism. And the revisionist interpretation of Cold War history, the Klarska Poreba meeting is also sometimes portrayed as a panicked reaction to the aggression of the West, and in particular to the naked imperialism of the Marshall Plan." One has to admit that the Marshall Plan was a benefit to the United States economy that still reverberates to this very day. They did not give money to the Western European countries. They provided goods and services. In his book, Cold War Economics, the Use of Marshall Plan Counterpart Funds in Germany, 1948 to 1960, Armin Grunbacher wrote the following, quote, "The U.S. government did not give money directly to the participating countries so they could buy whatever they thought they needed. Instead, the U.S. delivered the goods and provided services, mainly transatlantic shipping, to the participating governments, which then sold the commodities to businesses and individuals who had to pay the dollar value of the goods in local currency, known as counterparts, into so-called ERP special accounts that were set up at the country's central bank. This way of operation held three advantages: the provision of U.S. goods to Europe without European dollar payments, and helped to narrow the dollar gap that strangled European reconstruction. The accumulated funds could be used for investments in long-term reconstruction, as happened in France and Germany, or for paying off a government's war debts, as in Great Britain. And the payments of the goods in local currencies helped to limit inflation by taking these funds temporarily out of circulation while they were held in these special accounts. The Eastern Bloc countries of Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Albania, and, for a while, Yugoslavia were now under Soviet control. Trade was available, but predominantly only within the group. Now, this is only within what would be known as the Warsaw Pact nations. All of them had one-party rule and centrally planned economics. We know this. This was the way the Soviet system was working, and now they had to follow it. But there was one unifying cause, and that was a deep-seated hatred against the capital nations like the UK and America. Of course, this hatred did not come from the ordinary people. The ordinary person had no such hatred. This hatred came from the new elite in these countries, the communist leaders. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we continue our series on the Cold War. I'm not quite sure how many episodes we'll have on this one. It looks like it'll be somewhere between 3, 4, maybe even 5, but doubtful. I think it's just going to be a 4-part series. And this one's going to start with the first proxy war, the Korean War, fought between 1950 and 1953. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.